Good evening. Just to be sure, Sam Mahone, can you, if you can hear me, can you wave? That's fine. Then I'm going to assume everyone else can. Good. Folks, we have a very interesting problem here. Well, I'm glad to have, in a sense. We have significantly more people registered for this evening than we had planned. Therefore, the way we have set up Zoom is not the optimal way. So this is just a sort of Zoom meeting that is now up to, it's over 100 people already. We registered something like 100 people in the last 3 days over the weekend. We were not set up for that. So as the late great Bob Moses would say, we are going to make do this evening, right? And we'll be a little bit better prepared. But obviously that's a problem where we're delighted to have. But more than that, I'm just delighted to see some of the people who are online, some of the organizations who are represented. Some of you I have known virtually all of my adult life. Others I have not known personally, but have admired from afar. So I think this is the beginning of what's going to be a really, really wonderful series of conversations. And so my guess is, I mean, obviously I am thinking about just why the heck is everybody here? So, but I don't doubt that some of it is that a great many of us right now feel under attack, feel that our values are under attack. The CRT flim-flam, the arrogance of people who think that if they pass a law outlawing things that make them feel uncomfortable, then those things will go away somehow. So I think it is that general sense that many of us share, that we're in a moment of profound, fundamental societal change. And in that context, I don't think many of us are no longer satisfied with the approaches to education that we have been doing for the last 10 or 20, or in some cases 50 years, right? I think many of us are tired of piecemeal educational reform. Many of us are tired of educational research that definitively concludes that what we need is more educational research. I think we are trying to think of a way to shape education for the children that this country has never been committed to. That represents fundamental change for those children and for those communities. So in that context, I think a great many of us who have had experience with freedom schooling by one name or another are beginning to rethink what we have learned about freedom schooling and where freedom schooling can fit into this conversation. The short version of that for me is after 50 years of trying to figure this stuff out, I'm not sure I have seen anything that has the promise and the power of freedom schools. So, and by way of background, I should say, Teresa Perry recently reminded some of us that if we wanted to extend this back historically, we could start a discussion of freedom schooling that began prior to the end of slavery. For our purposes tonight, we'll take a much truncated view, and we'll we're moving from the premise that probably the most influential form of freedom schooling for most of us has been the schools that came out of Mississippi in 1964 during the tumultuous Mississippi Summer Project. A young SNCC worker named Charlie Cobb wrote a manifesto that condemned educational opportunities available to Black students in the state, and that led to the freedom schools. Cobb had envisioned schools that would serve 100 students. All of them would be high school students. They got 2,500 students. Their ages range from 7 to 70. They had to up the number of schools from 25, I'm sorry, to over 40. It is interesting to look at the schedule from a Holly Springs, Mississippi Freedom School teacher, July 11, 1964. Her schedule says school begins at 9 a.m., singing until 9:15, talk given by one of the voter registration people concerning events of the day before in Mississippi, 9:30 to 10:30, classes on Negro history and the movement, 10:30 to 11:30, classes in special interests, dancing, arts and crafts, science, sports, etc. 2-hour break. They come back for French, an arts and class, a music class, after which there's playwriting, debate, and journalism for teenagers, after which there is a seminar for nonviolence. And she says there will soon be a few more classes in things like politics and economics. We haven't started them yet because the teachers got here. We could talk for a long time about the vision, the values, the assumptions about youth development, which are built into that schedule, right? But for right now, I think it's safe, and I hope that later on, I'm sure actually that later on, we will have time to have some arguments, because I know a lot of you like to argue, but we'll have some arguments about different ways to conceive of freedom schools. But just for right now, I think it's safe to say that for most of us, we're talking about schools. And when I say this, I'm kind of channeling Septima Clark, as some of you know, that are centered on dignity. They respect the dignity of students by respecting their social identity, by respecting their potential, by respecting their own capacity to shape their own thinking and their own education. And at the same time, there are schools that are centered in a self-conscious way on building a sense of agency in students, on helping them to understand that they can shape their world, large and small. And the Children's Defense Fund Freedom Schools, which we'll be talking about off and on tonight, children are taught that they can make it, children of whatever age are taught that they can make a difference in their family, in their school, in their nation, in the world, right? And that notion that you matter enough to make change at all levels has always been a part of what I think is essential to freedom schools. And in the current political climate, I really want to stress that the freedom school model has been one of the relatively small handful of models, in my opinion, that has been genuinely interested in helping people to learn to think critically, as opposed to helping people parrot the values of another generation or of other people. And his original prospectus, which I think has either been dropped into the chat or will be dropped into the chat soon. Charlie Cobb said the reason that he wanted these schools was to get students to, quote, to articulate their own desires, demands, and questions, to stand up in classrooms around the state and ask their teachers a real question. He was not trying to get them to parrot anybody's viewpoint, including the viewpoint of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, of which he was a member. So we'll be hearing more about those schools tonight. But for right now, suffice it to say that the schools which developed in that summer, and in Mississippi, it was just really the summer of '64 with a few schools coming back in the summer of '65. But from that small seed, we have seen over the last 50 odd years, efforts in the spirit of the freedom schools that every place from Belfast to Belgrade. And in recent years, as I said earlier, probably the most familiar version of the freedom schools has been the freedom schools, which have been operated with great success by the Children's Defense Fund. Pre-pandemic, if my memory of the numbers is right, every summer they were operating 1,200 freedom schools around this country. That's just a staggering number when you think about it, when you think about the logistics and the training that goes into that. And yet, I think everybody who has worked with those schools, how can we reach more children with this, right? Everybody, I think, who's worked with those schools for any length of time has had the experience at the end of the summer of kids and parents saying, why can't regular school be like this? Why can't this be school, right? Well, in a way, that's exactly what we're asking, right? In the conversation that you're becoming a part of tonight. So this conversation tonight goes back to a series of conversations. It started just about last year, this time in Newark. A bunch of us from the school system, from the community, from local universities, had a series of intersecting conversations about our schools, especially our struggling schools, and how they could be supported, right? How we could do better by those schools and those students. And in the course of those conversations, the idea developed. We have had freedom schools in Newark, both on the Children's Defense Fund model and a number of other models, some of them dating back to the 1960s. Freedom schools have a long history in Newark, and in some ways we were reflecting on and drawing on that history. And the idea developed, suppose we took some of our schools that are struggling and we reimagined them along the principles and the underlying ethos of the freedom schools. What would that look like? What are the barriers to doing that? How do we move in that direction? And the idea has simply grown from that. And in that process, we wanted to reach out to other folk around the country to involve them in that conversation. We hope at least two things will grow out of this national conversation. One, we hope to, and we have already identified a group of localities that think they can move in the direction of full day schools as freedom schools, who think they can at least see some of the pieces to that. And right now, I hope I don't leave anybody out, but I think the places that have said that they think they are can see a pathway, or at least they think they have some of the pieces in place to do this kind of transformation of schools, right, would be Newark, Camden, Durham, North Carolina, Philly, and Allentown, Pennsylvania. At least people in those places think they can say, well, if we could do this and this, we can move in that direction. And everybody understands very clearly the political issues will be substantial, right? But the politics will be whether we move or not. Right? So I don't think that's a reason to not to start. So one of the things we hope will grow out of this conversation is a kind of informal coalition, a learning group among localities that are trying to say, we want schools that at their core and their DNA are devoted to these children, right? We do not want to simply have to put programs into schools. We want the school to be what it ought to be, and we want that to be publicly funded. The second thing we hope to grow out of this was just be a series of affinity groups, networks of people who are interested in doing some aspect of this work and doing it in conjunction with like-minded folk and learning from each other. So in the future, some of the likely panels will be, I think the next panel is likely to be, next couple of panels might be examples of some folk doing variations on freedom school work now. There will certainly be some panels organized around curriculum and pedagogy. We really hope that there'll be some affinity groups that come together to share curriculum that has already been developed and to develop new curriculum where that is needed. There'll definitely be a group that will come together around creating a research agenda around freedom schools. The research that exists is good, but we might be able to make more impact if we can take that research both upper level, but also make it better known, since much of it is good but hidden. I know I will get some pushback on this, but one of my favorite topics, and I've been arguing for 20 years that we need to pay attention to this, and the whole direction of the country proves me to be right. We need freedom schools for white people. Okay, white people who just have never had a chance to learn to think critically, right? So I'm making a joke of it, but Mike Miller, who has done organizing in a variety of social contexts for 50 or 60 years, is organizing a panel around that. Ernie Cortez, whom many of you know, G2 Brown, whom many of you know, will be organizing a panel on organizing and the role of organizing as a component of Freedom School. At some point, I think we do have to have a discussion around CRT and where that fits into our discussion. I believe Daniela Cook, who is the president of an association of teachers interested in CRT, will help to organize that. So we have a lot of things coming. We'll have a website up fairly soon, and all of this will go on it, and you will all be notified about that. But tonight we're going to be talking about the generation of the freedom schools in Mississippi, what the intent was in that process, and how that relates to our concerns and issues today. We have just a wonderful panel, a remarkable panel. I've worked with some of them many times, and I've never failed to learn from them. And to introduce the panelists, we have asked Crystal Moore Clements to take on that task. Crystal, by the way, is going to be organizing some of the panels on curriculum and pedagogy that are coming up right now. So I won't do a long introduction of her right now. I will just say that she has become a very important researcher on freedom schools in her own right. And I would just sneak in that they are working on a new training program for teachers. And I'm not gonna say anything more than that right now, but it's gonna be just so very, very exciting. So more to come. But the real point for right now is that Crystal Moore Clements is the new director of CBS Freedom School Program. So she's very much the appropriate person to introduce this panel. So Crystal, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here and introduce the esteemed panel. I'll start with Mr. Cobb. Charlie Cobb, in August of 1962, Charlie Cobb, a Howard University student, was on a bus trip to conference for student activists at Houston. He got off in Jackson, Mississippi, intended to take a quick look at the sit-ins before he went on to his conference. He never did get to that conference. Some members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee latched onto him, and the next thing he knew, he was up in the Delta, and there he would be for almost 5 years, fighting for the rights of Blacks to vote. In 1964, as part of the 1964 Mississippi Freedom Summer Project, he wrote a memo that led to the creation of summer schools designed to fill an intellectual and creative vacuum in the lives of young Negro Mississippians. They needed to get them to articulate their own desires, demands, and questions, to stand up at classrooms around the state and ask their teachers real questions. After Cobb left Mississippi, he helped to establish the Drum and Spear Bookstore in Washington, another important venture in community education. His career as a journalist included helping to establish NPR's first coverage of African affairs. He was a member of the editorial board of National Geographic and senior analyst at allafrica.com. He was founder of the National Association of Black Journalists. He was a founder. His books include Radical Equations, On the Road to Freedom, and The Nonviolent Stuff, and much, much more. Next to Gwendolyn Zohara Simmons. She grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, the first in her family to go to college. She became involved with the movement as a student at Spelman. Her involvement grew despite strong objections from her family and at the administration in Spelman. The Spelman administration also discouraged her from wearing her hair natural. In the summer of 1964, she went to Laurel, Mississippi, a particularly violent part of the state, to direct the freedom schools there. She was actually wound up doing that and directing the Freedom Summer Project for the town. She became an important shaper of the thinking that grew into Black power. Subsequently, her movement activities included membership in the Nation of Islam, a leadership role in the National Black Independent Party, a stint with the National Council of Negro Women, and a long tenure the American Friends Service Committee. Until her retirement, she was on the faculty of the University of Florida, where she researched the impact of Sharia law on Muslim women. Last, but certainly not least, my sister Ashley Henderson. For the last 90 years, the Highlander Research and Education Center has probably affected every significant movement for social justice in the South. It has been the place you go to learn to change the world. For the last 5 years, Ashley Henderson has been its co-director. Ashley is a Afro-Latin, African-American, Appalachian working class woman raised in Southeast Tennessee. She has served on the staff of the Chicago SNCC History Project. She's been a member of the United Students Against Sweatshops National Coordinating, the former regional project organizer for Project South, worked against environmental racism in Appalachia, and been an active participant in the movement for Black Lives, and a member of the board of directors of the Philanthropic Initiative for Racial Equity. Her resume is much longer than that, but this gives you a sense of the broad and deep commitment she has to social justice. And let me just say thank you all so much for being friends and supporters of the Children's Defense Fund Freedom Schools movement. I know many of you for many, many years, and it's just an honor and a privilege to introduce such an esteemed panel. So thank you and welcome everyone to this wonderful conversation.
Before we turn to the panel, we're going to have a very brief film clip on the Freedom Schools, in which both Zohara and Charlie Cobb are featured.
I am back. Sorry about that. Want to make sure that,
One of the most wonderful things about 1964 Mississippi summer were the Freedom Schools.
The state of Mississippi deliberately and systematically kept Black people uneducated and ignorant, and then turned around and made education a requirement in order to participate in the political process. We were able to do the Freedom Schools in the summer of 1964 because we had almost 1,000 students coming to the state of Mississippi, thus the human resources to actually, conduct classes.
We hope to find and develop and mold local leadership among the young people. We also hope to promote a better self-image among the local Negroes.
We would send out mass flyers and everything to the churches, telling people about the Freedom School, what the Freedom School was going to entail, the courses, the activities. We got the preachers involved, we got the kids involved.
Black people couldn't go to the library. It was for whites only. And so here they are, got their own library now. They would come excited to be exposed to the teaching and to browse the books.
In the public schools where I was in school, I had never heard of Dr. Seuss. It was at Freedom School where we actually not only read the story of the Cat in the Hat, but we acted it out. Having our lives enriched by these activities really made a huge difference in my life.
We taught African American history, civics, African culture, African dance. They were learning Black history, that they were reading books that had been written by Blacks that they'd never heard of.
How were slaves first introduced in America?
As we saw back on this world map over here, America started picking up slaves along here and then bringing them back.
What we were trying to do that summer is get people to talk about their own lives, talk about good and bad, and talk about ways in which you could bring about change. I think that was very much the drive of the program.
They had a sense of being needed by something much bigger than themselves and a sense of being able to handle the problems that they were needed for. They did it by asking questions and by being encouraged to feel free to ask questions.
They were raring to go. We were just kind of like the catalyst. We were agents of information and agents of a different world. So, I mean, just the very fact that we were talking about a world that they didn't know or didn't have much experience with was exciting to them and also to us.
We set them up for the little children to come, and every day we'd have classrooms of adults, people 50, 60, and 70 years of age. The adults came to the Freedom School to learn, just like the little children.
Any of you on the panel have any reactions to the film? Any comments you'd like to make about it?
Well, I certainly, I always love looking at the entire film and certainly enjoy being reminded of that wonderful experience I had as a Freedom School teacher in the 1964 Mississippi Freedom Summer Project in Laurel, Mississippi, because it really was wonderful for me as a person trying to teach for the first time in my life, but working with these young people who were so eager to learn all the new things. And they also taught me so much, even though I had come out of Memphis and certainly knew all about Jim Crow and racism and all of that. Mississippi was, you know, a little worse than what I had grown up with in Memphis. And so it was an incredible experience, one that changed my life forever.
The important thing you see in this clip, and certainly see in the full film, which I'm familiar with, and important to understand about what was unfolding in Mississippi, particularly with respect to the Freedom Schools, is that the schools themselves grew out of the organizing that was underway in the state. They grew out of the organizing for civil rights and freedom. And you can't disconnect those schools from this organizing that was taking place. And I think that's important for any discussion about education today, although I'm not quite sure how to pursue it, particularly with respect to public schools. But it's important to understand that you cannot disconnect education from struggle for social change, which is why these right-wing people today are all up in arms about critical oral history and all of that kind of thing.
Yes. I think just to build on what Charlie said, and I feel like it's something that Charlie continues to teach contemporary political and popular educators, is that none of this happens without focus on identity, purpose, and direction, right? And that folks weren't just being taught to be good citizens, they were being taught to actually do the work to build up power, build social movements to both attain that power and to be able to sustain that power, right? So the trajectory of the impact of the Freedom Schools before and after, during and after SNCC have all had that thing in common, that whether, it was a popular education model where everybody's a teacher or a learner, whether it was for K through 12 age young people or adult education or intergenerational, that when you left, you actually had more to do than just be a learner. And you had to think about that learning as in a lifelong process of identity, purpose, and direction.
Charlie, I want you to back up some chronologically and take us back to 1963 and what you were thinking, something of the context of the movement at the time that you were reacting to. What were you trying to get done?
Well, there's a practical aspect to this, and then a more political aspect to this, and this is some ways an artificial separation. The practical issue, and it's really another show to really dig into this, was the expectation of 1,000 or so students coming to the state to become a part of the Mississippi effort for change. So the practical question was, well, what are we going to do with them, actually? And we knew, for instance, that almost all of those students coming down would be white. Well, what would it mean as a practical matter, particularly to a movement that's trying to cultivate from the bottom up a sense among the people they're working with that they can do things that they never thought they could do? And we had fierce debates about this before we decided to go along with this summer project, as we called it, or Freedom Summer, as we also called it. I'll spare you all the ins and outs of that debate. Suffice to say, we had price debates, which really boiled down to what are we going to do with nearly 1,000 white students in this state, and using them to begin addressing a problem that we had long recognized, which we dubbed sharecropper education, that the schools, the public schools that young Black Mississippians were attending were designed to keep the students who attended them uneducated. The assumption underlying the Mississippi school system, public school system, was that Black students only need to be prepared for serfdom. Their job was to work for white people and be happy and satisfied about it. That's what the schools were designed to do. And we, even though we recognized it, we didn't have the means to address it in any significant way until we had the human resources, which is what the students represented. So that's one piece of the why and these freedom schools, this freedom school idea emerged. And we were anxious to see if we could figure out a way to tackle this whole question of education, because even a casual knowledge of history will show you, US history will show you that Black people throughout the history of their presence in the United States were denied education. There's always been a link between education and freedom, which is why schools were outlawed among Black people. Education was outlawed among Black people, and an important piece of Black history in this country are the secret schools that began to spring up in the midst of slavery. And there's a whole story that's undertold, I might say, about these secret schools, the kinds of roles educators played, and it goes all the way into the era of segregation, which is a part of the Highlander story for that matter. Septima Clark comes immediately to mind, both in terms of Highlander, in terms of the citizenship schools she established. There's always been a link between education and freedom struggle. I should say. And the freedom schools were just, and to tell you the truth, in writing that memo way back in those days, I had in my head places like Highlander, and I had in my head Septima Clark and what she was doing with SCLC via the citizenship schools. I had in my head, again, another undertold story of the heroism of Black teachers in public schools that defied the system in an effort to teach meaningfully Black students. I live in Florida, so Harriet Moore, the teacher, comes immediately to mind because on the first day of school, she took all the books the state had given her students and piled them up in the corner and had her own reading list and had her own discussion she wanted to have with respect to the education of Black. And this was direct defiance of the state, which wanted to keep. So all of these things are swirling in my mind as I'm trying to think through what to do with these students who are coming down. What could we do that hadn't been done because we lacked the resources? And these were organizers' questions. These were organizers' attempts to answer those questions. I saw it as an organizer more than I saw it as an educator. I still think that's relevant today myself.
Charlie, before I ask the other panelists to comment on what you said, I have also heard you say, if my memory is right, that Ella Baker's work with you had some impact on how you were thinking that winter.
Well, Ella Baker had a complete and total impact on almost everything we were thinking about, everything. Miss Baker was certainly, and she was Miss Baker to us because she was 57 years old when she made her way to us as sit-in students. Miss Baker was undoubtedly the single most important influence on our thinking. And what she taught us and encouraged us to do was think about the kind of world we wanted to live in. Ms. Baker was, like I said, she was the single most important grown-up on us. She educated us. I could take the next hour or two and give you a brief biography of Ms. Baker and my thinking about Ms. Baker. So it was not so much that she suggested a particular program, is that Ms. Baker encouraged us to use our own minds to generate ideas about the kind of world we wanted to live in.
Very good. Did either of the other panelists want to comment on anything that Charlie said?
I would just add, almost annoyingly so, and the SNCC vets continue to do that with a whole series of new generations who are doing this work, even when we ask them to just tell us what to do. So that tradition is well alive, both to our benefit and chagrin.
Okay.
Yes.
Actually, Charlie mentioned Septima Clark. Would you say something about her and the citizenship schools and how they connected to Highlander?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, and Charlie pointed at this, is it can be argued that as long as communities of resistance have come together to learn together, to the disdain of racialized capitalism, there have been freedom schools, right? But to really talk about the institutionality of freedom schools, its immediate predecessor is what Ms. Clark built. In a really great book to read if you're a nerd about freedom schools is Freedom's Teacher. It's the life story of Septima Clark. I'll drop a link. You can get it from Highlander. We sell it in our bookstore. And you can also go to the SNCC Digital Gateway, which also has an incredible just series of information about Ms. Clark and her work. So you can read more about her there. But the long story short of it is that this incredible woman, Septima Clark, who was an educator who had been, attacked in her job as a teacher because of her proximity to work to free Black people and to build Black power, started working with her cousin, Bernice Robinson, and a bus driver, a guy named Esau Jenkins, who shared Miss Clark's love and interest in adult education, really specifically. And so they started dreaming and scheming the concept of citizenship schools up, and they built the first citizenship school in, I think I saw somebody in the chat say they were from South Carolina. So we can thank South Carolinians, particularly in the Low Country, for these citizenship school models. They opened the first one in 1957. And then by 1961, they had started 37 citizenship schools all across the state, right? And multiple other islands in the Low Country. And this white guy, Miles Horton, who had founded, one of the founders of the Highlander Center, that had started back in the 30s in 1932, will be 90 years old next year, was like, hey, we see what you're doing. We want to invest. We want to support it. And this Black woman, before the internet, before cell phones, before social media, was training hundreds of thousands of Black Southerners and creating educational interventions across race and geography to the tune that some of us would think was successful, and maybe even bigger than what we think is successful in a 21st century context, right? And Ms. Clark was doing that. She would have argued that it was not perfect, that we constantly had to be paying attention to the model and revamping the model to meet contemporary needs. I think I can hear Charlie in my head being like, it's got to be rooted in somebody's good community, right? That's the point of it being an organizing intervention. And one of the things that she said was a basic belief about citizenship schools as she developed them before and during her stint at Highlander was that there was a belief that creative leadership was already present in her community, right? That it wasn't that she was going to give or empower people something that she had that they didn't already have in possession. That actually it was already there, and all it took was discovery and development to see that blossom into self-determination. And so, why I think the model that Ms. Clark developed and why the Highlander story is important, I think is actually really critical to some of our development of freedom schools in a 21st century context, not only because of its success story and the ways that it became transgenerational and intergenerational and the ways that it touched so many people and the ways that it was rooted in community, but also is really specifically the ways that racialized capitalism then turned around and attacked it, right? The reason that Ms. Clark and Dorothy Cotton ended up holding citizenship schools at SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, wasn't just because Highlander moved on to other work. It was because the state literally shut us down, attempted to shut us down for doing this kind of educational intervention that was creating these communities of empowered practice. And even as we try to express, what it is to be a school in a 21st century context as a folk school now at Highlander, many of you know that we were attacked in March of 2019 by white supremacists who were still threatened by the idea that community-controlled education is actually a way towards collective liberation and beloved community. And so it is still very much a threat to the state as we know it. It is still very much a threat to white supremacist patriarchy. It is still very much a threat to the systems that would see Black communities in particular still be held in marginalized and oppressed situations and conditions. So I think it's absolutely something there's something about the model that even in a 21st century context is a threat, which must mean it's right. It must mean it's got something to do with this power building business. And it's why Highlander is still committed to it 90 years later.
Let me very quickly add that Highlander, and I'm happy to say this with Ashley present, Highlander was the first freedom school for SNCC workers. This is where we held our workshops. This is where we did our training. This is where the debate over voting as distinct from direct action unfolded. The Highlander was always open for the education of SNCC workers, as well as the use of the institution by SNCC workers.
Yeah, and that love story continues now. I mean, we were honored to rock out with y'all even this last week at the SNCC 60th. So, you know, that story is a very long story. I remember John Lewis being one of the only elected officials to say something after the fire. And he was like, you know, it's where I trained. He said it's where he had his first integrated meal. You know, Rosa Parks said it was the first time she'd ever been at a place where white women cooked for her. You know, so you might hear mythology about Rosa Parks and the story about the bacon. That's the story about the bacon, right? We're building and we're committed to that, right? We're not just a living museum. We are building up the next generational cohort of the folks that will lead and steward and sum up the Southern freedom movement of the 21st century. And we're doing that in partnership with folks like SNCC Legacy. We're doing that in partnership with folks like the Children's Defense Fund and many, many, many others in every Southern state, nationally and internationally. The last thing I'll say that I think we've learned in our model of how we do popular education work is that is in a 21st century context, really challenging this idea of building good citizens. I think we've learned a lot from the model of the Danish folk schools in Denmark, who have told us like, hey man, we got really good at training people to be good citizens, but they don't really understand this freedom stuff, right? They don't understand this, like this social movement stuff. They just want to get a good job doing, you know, community gardening, but they don't actually understand that in the context of like a social movement to end climate disasters, right? Like, so there's something about the way that marginalized and oppressed folks in the US have taken this idea of democratic education and really challenge. And I see some of my comrades who have survived some of these never-ending conversations about democratic education. It's like democratic education for who and for the sake of what, right? And I think that what Ms. Clark made possible, what Ella Baker made possible, what SNCC made possible, what Highlander and CDF are making possible is really pushing us to think about, like, we want popular education and political education for the sake of liberation as a practice. And that it's not just about giving somebody a certificate to say they came through our courses, right? It's actually about organizing and building power that not only can be fought for now, but can be sustained once they win it.
I want to come back a little bit later to some of the things that Highlander is doing right now in a bit more detail, but I want to jump back first to Zohara. Zohara, you described yourself as a teacher in Laurel, but you are actually the director of the Freedom Schools, is my understanding. So would you say more about that project, how it developed and what you learned from it?
Certainly, I went there to be the Freedom School director and wound up being the director of the entire project. But one of the things that was unique, somewhat unique about Laurel was that there was no movement infrastructure. When the three of us arrived there was no movement as such, and we had to go to Hattiesburg, 30 miles south of Laurel, to actually sleep and then drive up and knock on doors to try and develop a project. So what was so remarkable was that we went from that, three of us knocking on doors, asking people, are you interested in having a project here? And the first person whose door I knocked on, Mrs. Eberta Spinks, was just, I mean, you know, I thought, wow, this is divine intervention, because when I knocked on her door and was trying to explain why I was there, she said, are you one of those freedom riders? And I said, yes, ma'am. And she said, come on in, I've been waiting on you all my life. So that literally was the beginning of the Laurel Project. And in terms of what we were able to do there, we went from three, what became two really, after the director had to leave. We went from 2 people to 23 volunteers. So we developed a freedom school. We had difficulty getting a building because everybody was terrified that if they rented to us, that building would be burned or bombed. But we finally got a man who owned a place that was boarded up to rent it to us. And so the community members came out and basically put a roof on the place, put windows in some cases had to put flooring in, and that became our Freedom School, our Freedom Library, and the headquarters for our project. And children came in droves. I mean, I was stunned at how interested they were. And of course, their parents were interested in them being there. And as a part of, as Charlie has mentioned, the Freedom Schools were an integral part of the organizing work that we were doing there, which included organizing for voter registration and laying the groundwork for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And so for the high school students, we involved them in voter registration work. And the other thing that was really, I had not expected, and as you saw in the documentary, we had adults who said, we want to be a part of the school. Can we do that? And in some cases, they actually came during the day, but then we had to set up evening classes, some of which were literacy training. But we can never separate the Freedom Schools from the political organizing that we were engaged in. And the young people were learning all kinds of things. One of the great things about the curriculum that has been talked about was it was a curriculum about the students asking questions, learning through questioning. It was very clear to us that their own history had to be the foundation for the work we were doing. One of the reasons I wanted to go to Mississippi as one of the few Black volunteers, student volunteers, was because of the Freedom Schools. And it was my privilege to have worked with Staunton Lynn, who became the state director of the Freedom Schools. And he was my professor for the 2 years that I was at Spelman. And I had the opportunity to work with him on the curriculum development. And that's when I knew I had to go, because I knew that as a Black child who had never learned the history of Black people, and I had not learned of the liberation struggles that Black people had engaged in from the time they were brought here in chains, and how liberating that was for me, and how it changed my whole idea about myself, my people. And that was one of the main things that I wanted to teach in the Freedom Schools, because I knew how liberating that was. So it was an amazing situation. I mean, and as has been said, it was threatening. We did get almost to the end of the summer before the Klan firebombed our place, and the fire department parked their fire truck and just watched it burn. So we had at 3,000 volume library, we had probably more books than the local library did. And so, and just as you saw in the documentary, the young people were so eager to take out books because, you know, they had never been able to go to a library. But it was an incredible part of the project. It was a political endeavor. We were very clear about that. And it had a marvelous cultural component that I just want to mention very briefly. We had the Free Southern Theater that came through and put on plays for the whole community. But in addition to the actual plays, they did workshops with students, got them involved in playwriting, and we had musicians to come through, folk singers. So it was cultural, it was education for liberation. It was a wonderful, wonderful endeavor.
If I might, Zahara referred to Mrs. Spinks as being one of the building blocks of the movement in Laurel. Charlie, first, would you say something about, just more broadly, or maybe both of you, about the role that Black women were playing in the movement broadly, and then sustaining Freedom Schools specifically at that time? Then I would like both Charlie and Ashley to pick up on the issue of culture as a tool in the work that you're doing.
Well, I've said more than once and in more places that I can remember that you really wouldn't have had the kind of Mississippi movement that emerged without the leadership of women. And please note that I say leadership of women as distinct from without the role of women. When I think of leadership in Mississippi in those days, it's the women who come to mind. I know a lot about the strong men, the World War II veterans and the NAACP leaders like Medgar or Amzie Moore, but I say this movement that was emerging from, say, 1961 throughout the rest of the decade was led by women. And I recommend Judy Richardson's book, Hand on the Freedom Plow, as one window into the kind of role and interaction between SNCC people and local women. And that's all I'll say, really, all I have to say really about that. You know, your second question, what was it? You wanted to know?
Culture, the role of culture and cultural activity.
Well, culture, like Zahara mentioned the Free Southern Theater, and I enjoy telling this story because I said the only play I ever saw by the Free Southern Theater, I went to see with Mrs. Hamer. And in talking with her after about what she thought about the play and what she got from the play, she told me, she says, well, they're about the two characters. She said, well, they're waiting too. And that's how she understood that play. So culture, poetry, Julian Bond published a book of poetry by Freedom School students. I don't know whether it's still available or not, but almost in all of these schools, students, and I'll leave it to more knowledgeable people than me, seem to like to write poetry and were continuously producing poetry. And of course, there's music. And, you know, among older people, freedom songs were often variations of traditional church music. Among young people, however, the variations often were drawn from contemporary music. James Brown, I can think of songs for James Brown and Ray Charles and the like. Those did not come out of the churches. It came out of young people involved with the movement. So culture, although we didn't have in most places what might be called, quote, cultural programs, Black culture was very much a part of the movement. And the movement spoke to Black culture, didn't run away from it. The way, you know, once upon a time, Howard University School of Fine Arts did not include blues and jazz. It was not considered fine arts. The movement was exactly the opposite. Culture Black culture was just a natural part of the movement, and we and the people we worked with embraced it, whether they embraced it in church or whether they embraced it on the street, just with their own music and, of course, dance. That's a story, I think, that is also largely undertold. To the extent that there is a discussion of, say, the Black arts movement, it's usually confined to places and people and experiences above the Mason-Dixon line, not so much below the Mason-Dixon line. It's not really looked at that way. If I can recommend a book, there is a book that came out about a year ago called SNCC's Stories. And it's written by a British professor. And she explores literature that emerged inside of SNCC, poetry, music, playwrights, because people forget, even within SNCC, I mean, there was a fairly strong literature culture. And it never makes newspapers and magazines or anything like that. But this one professor has done a book that actually looks at it and analyzes and pushes forward writers and artists in SNCC. It was a very valuable part of movement life and what helped sustain you in some of the rougher times, when you really need to sort out what you were up against, what you were dealing with, and where you might be going with this movement.
I'd just like to add that, of course, we created the Freedom Singers that were such an integral part of SNCC's work. And of course, the Freedom Singers did come to projects. But, we had Pete Seeger, we had Julius Lester, we had other folk singers. It was, while we didn't say it was a cultural program, it clearly was, because these, we'd have them come, the churches where they might perform. In some cases, they had to perform outside if we couldn't get a church to open their doors. People would come in droves for this. And let's not forget the role of music in our mass meetings. I can't even imagine there being a movement without the music. And I think Bernice Johnson Reagan of the Freedom Singers and also of Sweet Honey in the Rock, she talks about that, because I know whenever I was arrested or in jail, it was the music that sustained me, and us as a group, the more frightened we were, the louder we sang. So the music was an integral part.
Let me just add a little bit to that. If you're in jail and you're isolated, you're not always in the same cell with people. They might be strung along a corridor of cell, and you don't know whether somebody's alive, hurt, or even dead. And one way to communicate, and was done, I'm thinking of Macomb, Mississippi in particular, it's done through song. So if Hollis is singing in one song and he gets a response from somebody in another cell, and you recognize the voices, you know that people are alive, if not well. And that was an important role of song. Again, an undertold story about movement life and movement experience. But people that did time in Parchman Penitentiary have vivid stories about this.
Yes. Yeah, I think two really quick thoughts. One is that, and it might feel like that's a very 1960s story, but when you read reports from the Movement for Black Lives and from Clear at CUNY and others, where Donald J. Trump literally told the Attorney General William Barr to charge Black protesters and protesters that were protesting in defense of Black lives last year of all sorts of races with federal charges instead of the state and local equivalents, then you know that it is very much a 21st century story, right? And that story, that's just true in a US context, that when we're talking about the impact of cultural organizing as an educational intervention in Brazil and Haiti and South Africa and Nigeria and many other places across the diaspora, that it's even more, it's like not even more critical, but it's critical in an even more dire way, right? In a 21st century context. The last thing that I'll say is that I think the thing that we're continuing at Highlander, and many of us that are base builders that are building cultural organizing into our methodological work, is that it's a very proven methodology, right? That if you pair art and culture with faith and spirit, or if we want to whitewash it, we can call it holistic wellness, right? If you take art and culture and holistic wellness, that you will change policy and practice. It's not only about engaging both the educator and the student in a way that might be actually just more practical for their learning experience or for their ability to share what they are already experts in. But it's also a way that if you change the culture and the politics, you'll change the policies and practice.
Come on, Quanah.
Yeah.
Remind folks to mute. Just so we can-
Could everybody who's not on the panel mute, please?
We might need our
She needs to be in the
host.
channel.
before then.
That's 6 o'clock. She needs to be the news anchor.
I don't think she knows she's not muted.
You know, I got on Facebook and said that.
Hey, Bianca, we can hear you, boo.
Put it in the chat.
Who is this?
Oh, Benita.
It's Bianca Woodard. I can see the
I'm
monitor.
sorry.
There we go.
That's
Yeah,
cool. Thank you.
let me add very
Thank-
quickly, again, in relationship to Highlander, We Shall Overcome made its way into the movement by a Highlander and the Nashville students who had been sitting in and who were attending a workshop / conference organized by Septima Clark. But We Shall Overcome's real roots go back 100 years to a song called I'll Overcome, but it was changed at Highlander by the Nashville students, who then brought it to a SNCC meeting, and it made its way, because Reverend King liked the song, into the wider movement.
No, that's right. I mean, the story that gets told is that, people who we also, have regard for, folks like Guy Carawan and Pete Seeger, the reason that Black people know We Shall Overcome, but what's actually true is a Black woman wrote it, is the way I was told the story. A Black woman who's never been given credit for the work that she did. That song then got transformed by exactly what Charlie said, by the Nashville student movement, and spread everywhere because everybody was coming through Highlander and sharing all of their songs and chants and all of it, right? And what people don't know as often is that when the song got copywritten, that the royalties came to Highlander to be an administrator of those resources back out to African-American communities in the South, in the US South, that are doing work at the nexus of art and activism. So we still, to this day, have a We Shall Overcome fund that is re-granting those royalties back out to Black communities in every Southern state, all across the Black Belt, that are doing this incredible life-saving work of cultural organizing intervention. And cultural organizing is still a methodology that we prioritize in our training and leadership development work.
I just wanted to add that everything that everyone has articulated is all still alive and well within the CDF Freedom Schools movement. And so I just want to highlight the work of Ella Baker. We were just talking about her a few moments ago in terms of, for what Mrs. Edelman, Marion Wright Edelman, had envisioned in 1993. And I know Dr. Z is going to talk a little bit about this, so I don't want to take too much time. But, I just want to highlight, so in 1993, she reimagined, the 64 freedom schools and said, how can we do this in a more contemporary context? And her and her team, developed the Ella Baker trainers, right? So today, in fact, we have our director of Ella Baker leadership. She's on, Ms. Shaquita Pagee. And we have some of our Ella Baker trainers on tonight. And we just wrapped a training at Alex Haley Farm a few weekends ago, really highlighting the work of servant leadership. And so the fact that you could be in a contemporary freedom schools, then you can come to the Children's Defense Fund and go through leadership and organizing training that is called the Ella Baker Leadership Training and Orientation, where we talk about her work, we talk about servant leadership, and we keep them at the forefront of that movement. And again, within the Children's Defense Fund Freedom School curriculum, we have what we call Cheers and Chants, right? So we're bringing in that music where we are really articulating to our young people through what we call Harambe, Kiswahili for Let's Pull Together, a centering activity where we're going to get on one accord so that we can train this next generation of servant leaders. Because when you sign up for a summer enrichment program through the Children's Defense Fund Freedom Schools, you're saying, I'm going to come to a weekly parent meeting. I'm going to read a book a week. I'm going to do my cheers and chants. I'm going to engage in a social action project led by the Children's Defense Fund, but looks differently in all these different communities. And so it's really an opportunity for us to, give credit to Dr. Z and to Charlie and everyone else who had, paved the way. And so it's very much alive and well, but just in a new iteration. I welcome anybody to come to the farm to see it in action. We got hybrid training going on because of COVID now. However, it's a really beautiful articulation of what has been stated already. So I just wanted to highlight that.
I want to turn this, I want to turn to audience questions in a second now, but I want to ask all of you, all four of you, that includes you, Crystal, whether you think about the freedom schools of 64. I know some of you had some contact with Black Panther Liberation Schools as well, which is a model that I think is connected and grew out of it, and other forms of freedom schooling, including Highlander, and including contemporary CDF freedom schools. What is your understanding? What have you seen? What kind of impact do they have on students? What kind of impact do they have on the teachers? Right, that stands out for you. And Charlie, you start, please.
Well, I want to talk about the Panthers for a second. The Panthers with their schools proved, and they had exceptional success with their schools, proved that it was possible to provide meaningful education for liberation, as well as reading, writing, and arithmetic. It was possible to provide meaningful education in inner city schools that had been written off by the system. They had extraordinary success. Nobody looks at it now, which is unfortunate, because they were doing something that we weren't. They were piloting how you got meaningful education in urban arenas. Remember, SNCC primarily organized in the rural Black Belt South, and that's not the same as South Central LA or Oakland or the west side of Chicago or any of these big and in some ways more complex arenas than Sunflower County or Issaquah County or Tallahatchie County. And I think, without going into the complex history of the Panther Party and what happened to the Panther Party, and part of what happened to the Panther Party was sabotaged by the federal government. Without going into the complex history of the Panther Party, what they did, I thought, to the extent that I looked at it, I'm an East Coast person, I'm not really familiar with a lot about the West Coast, struck me as extraordinarily, and I emphasize extraordinarily, successful.
So Howard, do you want to speak to the impact issue, then Ashley, and then Crystal?
Okay, well, certainly, I had a wonderful experience in 2014. I went first to Hattiesburg for the 50th anniversary celebration of Freedom Summer. And there was a gentleman that came up to me and he says, I know you don't remember me. He said, but I was one of your students in the Freedom School in Laurel, Mississippi. And it was just amazing. And I mean, we just went off into a corner and sat down and chatted and about, his memories of the school and what it had meant to him. And I know that many of those students were impacted, in a very profound way. And I'm happy that we have, and of course, Crystal knows Dr. Harris, who has been involved with me in some of the training with the CDF leaders. And he has written 2 or 3 books about his, what happened to him. And he's in the clip that we saw because he was one of the young children attending the Freedom Schools. I also had an experience in Philadelphia after I moved there, doing Freedom Schools there. It's no doubt in my mind that it is a model that can be emulated and should be emulated. We have got to save our children. And I mean, we all know what's happening to them with the school to prison pipelines. And, it may not be sharecropper education, but it's working at McDonald's education, kind of stuff going on now. And some judge actually had the gall to note that why would poor people need more than the equivalent of an 8th grade education? So, we are definitely in a situation where we don't have a choice. We have to find a way to do some of the things you were talking about, Charles Payne, when you first began our discussion. We have got to save our children, and we can do it with weekend schools, summer schools, until we can hopefully get our hands on some of these public schools but before that, we can't wait. We have to do weekend schools and summer schools to teach our children education for liberation. No question about it.
Yeah, I mean, just to build, I think I totally agree with what my comrades and elders have said before me. I also think that we've got to build democratic education to save our people. Because exactly what happened with the Summer Freedom Schools, and exactly what happened with Miss Clark's citizenship schools, and what's happening now contemporarily at Highlanders, that there's no way we build educational interventions that don't include everybody because the education system as we've inherited is trash. It's trash for all of us. And what we know is that those very young people who we might have missed in our interventions, with their 3rd, 4th grade reading scores down here in the South, they very well may be sharecroppers still. And they very well may end up with a prison bed, because that's how at least the state of Tennessee, and I know the state of Mississippi, and I know the state of Arkansas, and I know the state of Georgia are basing their prison beds off of our children's scores, right? So it's very much still, an intergenerational problem. And when I think about, obviously Highlanders model is very particular. We truly believe that the most directly impacted are the best experts in what the solutions were. We believe that for real in our practice. We also truly believe that all of us, myself included, are always on a lifelong journey to being more educated people, that it doesn't stop with just one training or one leadership development class or one capacity building institute or grant, right? That it's a lifelong commitment. So that's why Highlander can be 90 years old, is because people keep coming back because there's still more for us to learn, right? And in that, we're all teachers and we're all learners, right? That we push back around the teacher-student dialectic. We think it's a fake fight. We all are in it to learn. And so what we're building is containers for education where all of us learn with the expectation that we do something with the new knowledge that could only exist if we came together across what might be perceived and what might be a colonizer's story about our differences. When I think about how to measure its success, I hear Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark said, as I saw people work in their communities and decide to attempt some of the things that came out of their citizenship schools recommendations, then they succeeded in doing things like being able to get checks signed at banks or getting recognized among their own people and in their own churches. And then I knew that the experiment had worked out. She said that some of the ways that, or some of the things that were most consistently said about people's experiences in the citizenship schools is it was the first place that they ever felt human. That's the kind of educational interventions we ought to be making, good people, is one where our people get to feel wholly human and actually be in the practice of freedom, right? Our educational spaces at Highlander are literally for folks to practice, right? To practice intergenerational organizing, to practice cultural organizing, to practice language justice, to practice these things that we believe are the methodologies required, the tactical interventions required to build and sustain the movement victories. So, I think for me, when I'm thinking about the contemporary experiences of the generations long lessons of building these sorts of schools, these sorts of educational interventions, is that it's really got to be rooted in trust that these communities can actually see different material conditions if they have the resources and capacity to be able to implement the solutions that can only come from them, and that's the kind of educational curricula that we're building at Highlander.
And to echo that, what I would hope for is to see a CDF Freedom School program in every community across the country. If it can be attached to every public school or school district in the country, the students will have a reprieve, right? They will be able to use their summers to think about how they can be the next generation of movement builders. I think one of the beautiful things about the CDF Freedom Schools model is that it's predicated upon intergenerational leadership. So you're gonna have someone like Dr. Harris or Dr. Z come and train. And I stand here before you today. I was dropped off at Haley Farm at 20 years old to be a servant leader intern. I didn't really understand what I was getting myself into. But once I got there, I met Unita Blackwell. I met Alice Walker. I met Reverend Joan Parrott. I met all these wonderful movement building people who asked me the question, does my work speak to the after? And it really made me think about, what am I doing? And that led me to getting a doctorate. That led me to being a faculty member. And full circle moment, I'm here with you as the National Director of Freedom Schools, only because someone gave me an opportunity. And that's what Freedom Schools can do. And Mrs. Edelman, she always talks about, you can't be what you can't see. And the beautiful thing about the Freedom Schools movement now is that we know it's hard for people. And so CDF builds curriculum each year so that we can disseminate it to our partners, so that you don't have to start from scratch with culturally responsive pedagogy. Some of the data that we've seen over the years is that with 6 weeks of summer enrichment that is built on, I can and must make a difference in myself, family, community, country, world, with hope, education, and action. Just in 6 weeks, we see young scholars with 8 months of reading gains. And so we are an academic intervention, but we also are a social movement where, when I was dropped off at the farm, they told me, okay, get ready. It's a summer of service. but a lifetime commitment, to echo what my sister Ashley just said. And so I really hope, while pre-COVID numbers, we were strong, and I hope that we can get back to that, and that people, whether you are a faith-based agency, whether you're a community nonprofit agency, whether you're a school district or a higher education partner, there is space for freedom schools within your local context. And, I'm just gonna put it out there. Come holler at me, because I will help you do it. Because we need to do it. It's an imperative. It's a moral imperative at this point.
I want to thank, before we move to question and answers, the one thing that I will say about the impacts that I've seen that I don't hear from, specifically in my case, Children's Defense Fund freedom schools, I'm absolutely convinced that they have a remarkably positive impact on how young people react to other young people. There's a peer change that goes on. And two, having done parent organizing both in traditional schools and in freedom schools, it is day and night different. Parents respond so differently to the freedom school context. And so we can, maybe at another time or later in the questions, we can come back to some of that. But right now, Crystal, I want to stop. I'm sorry. I've gone way longer with a panel than I had intended to, because I got too wrapped up in the discussion. So we don't have as much time for question and answers as I hope, but we'll go a little bit later than we had planned, if that's okay with people. I know some of you have already been dropping questions in the chat. If others of you have questions, please do so. We'll try to respond to as many of them as we can, given the large number of questions in a small amount of time. But let me say that I will turn things over now to my colleague, Jamelia Harris. She is one of those terrible, terrible critical race theorists that come out of the state of California. She recently finished her doctorate at UCLA, and she's doing a postdoctoral fellowship, Robert Curbin postdoctoral fellowship, named after a famous social activist in Newark. She's doing a postdoctoral fellowship with us at the Cornwall Center at Rutgers Newark. So Jamelia, I hand it to you now.
Thank you so much, Charles. And thank you again to the panelists for sharing just such an incredible wealth of knowledge and wisdom. And we all just learned so much from you. So we received so far 4 questions from the audience. I'm going to start out with our first question. So Mr. Cobb referenced the inability to separate the organizing and advocacy as the impetus for the Freedom School. What thoughts does the panel have around what that could look like today? And what strategies would you recommend for sparking activism amongst Black and Brown students in our communities? And so that's open for the entire panel, but Charlie, if you want to start us out.
Well, one, to me anyway, one fairly clear area of activism that's necessary, setting aside, I could say, just organizing a school independent of the public school system. But a key area needing a great deal of activism, it seems to me, has to do with local school boards. To put this simply, I think we have to struggle to take over these school boards. And to do that, you have to organize in the community. One of the things I did a book many years ago with Bob Moses on his algebra project, Radical Equations, and in moving in communities and speaking to people about education and the schools their kids were going to, what struck me was how intimidated so many people in the communities were by local school boards. They seem out of reach, distant. The idea of being able to talk and raise what you wanted school to provide just seemed foreign to them. And so I think there's a lot of work around to be done, and activism to be done around the necessity of, getting rid of a lot of these school boards. I mean, in Jacksonville, where I live, this city argued for 3 years over renaming a school name, public school that was majority Black, over renaming it because it was named for Robert E. Lee. I mean, it was a big issue, but when you looked at who's participating in this argument, and they just decided last year to get rid of the name. And when you look at who's in these arguments, they really are not. Most of the people in the community, in the neighborhood where I live, for instance, Black, working class, retirees, weren't in that discussion. If you talked to them on their front porch, they had definite ideas about what they thought about this. So it occurs to me that there's a big fight, particularly now that all of this stuff is being raised by Trump's people over critical education, and which is really just a way of trying to abolish any serious discussion of race and racial history in this country. There's a serious need to wage a fight, to engage in activism around local school boards. You know, I'm take the organizer's view, simple, put one foot in front of the other, make sure you're clear to people, you know, in the community. That's what I think. I don't go much further with big ideas about change. I can see the possibility of being able to take over school boards and get rid of some of these right-wing people who control local school boards.
Well, I mean, to follow up on what you just said, Charlie, you know, we're a bit behind because believe you me, the right wingers are already taking over school boards.
I know.
And this is a major agenda item for them. I'm here in Florida also. I'm in Gainesville, where we have had, you know, and are engaged in a real struggle. And we had advanced where we had a majority Black school board, the first time ever. And I'm talking progressive Blacks. And let me tell you, it was 3 Black women, progressives, and 2 white men. And there was a concerted effort that the governor got involved with to get rid of one of those Black women and put a woman who had been head of the Republican Party in our county. So this struggle is ongoing. When I think about what we can do in terms of the students, because, you know, you and I were in Mississippi, and this whole Freedom School was connected and an integral part, as you have so rightly said, of the movement that was being built there. So now that we have, you know, so many young people and old people too involved in Black Lives Matter and the like, I think we need to be working with young people. And at this point, it will probably have to be after school programs, as well as summer programs, weekend programs that utilize the fact that we have all of these people focused on Black Lives Matter, the police and the killing and maiming of Black people and brown people and all people really. So that this is something that we could be organizing our young people around, because it's in the news, they're all aware of it, particularly at the high school level, and getting them involved in the various chapters. Like we have the Dream Defenders here, and I know some of them are on this call. I hope that they are or will be reaching out to high school age students particularly. The other thing that we've been doing here locally is struggling to get Black history taught in our schools. And we formed some years ago an African American History Task Force, which is a part of a statewide African American History Task Force. So this is really critical to get that into the public schools. here in the state of Florida, it is a part of our Constitution, but believe you me, they're not doing it. So these are things that we really should be doing locally across this country.
Before the other panelists,
One more thing on that. One more
let
thing
me
on that,
interject one thing,
Charles.
Ashley.
Yeah.
Charlie and Zahara have mentioned a number of specific kinds of activities, working on school boards, teaching African American history, working on weekend schools. If somebody mentions something that you are interested in doing with others, please make a note of that in the chat so that other folk who share your interest will know how to reach you. I'm sorry, Ashley, go ahead.
No, that's right on target. I mean, I hear Cabral in my head saying, tell no lies and claim no easy victories. And I would paraphrase that to tell no lies, claim no easy strategies. Because not because I disagree with my colleagues, I actually truly believe that we should have community controlled school boards, community controlled schools. And I agree with the comments in the chat that they should have students on those bodies, those governance bodies. I believe that's true for guardians and community members and educators as well. My fear, and this actually goes to what Zahara was offering about what's going on in Florida, because it's what's happening in every southern state, is twofold. One is that if I tell you to go and take over your local school board and you do it, and then your governor preempts your ability to do anything, that, or your state legislature, most of whom, if you live in the South, are right-wing supermajorities, then I will have told you to engage in this more localized strategy. You might even win and then lose again. So I want to not pretend like the fix to democratic education as we want to see it is just taking over school boards, because it's actually going to require a multi-tactical long-term strategy, which is what the white right got right. They built a 50-year strategy, in part because they were pissed off about having to integrate their seminaries. That's where the Tea Party came from, right? Yeah. And so it was a response to our interventions around building, culturally competent education for our people, particularly our young people. So what I want to say is, like, just know that it's not as simple as just taking over your local school board. You're going to have to do some state work. And then likely, if we can't keep the feds, we'll have to do some Fed work too, right? And that's why we need people engaging on multiple levels. It's something that we've been doing at Highlander. I know, like, especially under Starsky, Pastor Starsky Wilson's leadership at CDF, that's and has been under Dr. Edelman's leadership, has been a multi-tiered strategy. The second thing that I would say is that, some of the ways that we held power over the governance of our schools in Black communities, particularly in a Southern context, which is what I know. I'm like Charlie, I can't speak about the coastal elites, but I can tell you about the hillbillies and the endangered sharecroppers down here where I'm from. Is it the way that we held governance over our schools and were able to build more democratic education opportunities for our people was through neighborhood schools. But with gentrification and the forced displacement of our communities, our ability not only as a voting bloc to hold power, but as parents and guardians to hold power over the schools that our children were going to is shifting. So I also think it's about being intentional about paying attention to how the lines are being drawn, about who gets to choose where kids go to what schools, which kids go to what schools, is something for us to keep our thumbs on. The last thing that I'll say on it, and especially for those of you that are interested in the policy pieces of governance and how that impacts our young people and education for all people, I would say, check out the Vision for Black Lives policy platform that we wrote in the Movement for Black Lives. Highlander is a proud member of the Movement for Black Lives. We're on the leadership body. We helped write the Vision for Black Lives policy platform that came out in 2016 and have been involved in the rewrites that have been dropping all year and will come out next year. Many pieces of this policy platform have local, state, and federal demands around education. Demanding that education be acknowledged as a human right, recognizing that education should be included in any reparations package for Black people in this country, et cetera. That resources that are going to harm our communities should actually be going to build democratic education for our communities, right? So there's multiple ways that education comes up in the Vision for Black Lives policy platform. I would check it out if you're looking for policy demands.
Crystal, did you want to add anything? Jamelia, well, let me say one thing, though. And I know this is an issue that'll come up repeatedly, I think, as we go along. I suspect very few folk would disagree with the idea that we have to be multi-level, multi-issue in the way we go. I worry about discouraging people who are not in motion to worry about what's going to happen after their first victories. I think we can just assume that every victory is going to put you on a plateau where there'll be a fight that you couldn't see from the previous plateau. And so the governor may, in fact, negate whatever your school board does, but I would not want people to not do what they can do because they're afraid of what might happen down the line. And so I think we have to have both of those positions in our heads at the same time.
Yeah, I think it's less about discouraging people from doing what they can do. I think it's though learning from what we have done. Mm-hmm. And what we have done is take over school boards and been preempted. So I think it's about making sure that we're building multi-tactical strategies so that the way that we have to fight at the next plateau is different than what we've already done.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Jamelia?
Thank you. Our next question, could someone talk about Boston's Noel Day contribution to the Freedom School curriculum?
Unfortunately, that's not my area of expertise, but I'd love to hear about it.
Well, I knew Noel.
Go for it, Charlie.
Well, look, before the Freedom Schools that emerged in 1964, Noel had what effectively was a freedom school in Boston. In some ways, he pioneered this in a different kind of way than, say, Highlander, but he was one of the pioneers, let me put it that way, of meaningful freedom education for Black students, because he functioned in an inner city in Boston. And he was close to SNCC, and therefore he became a part of that initial curriculum committee that was formed to fashion, if you will, an educational program that would be implemented by Freedom Schools in the summer of 1964. Because remember, most of us in this organizer, in this conversation about Freedom Schools, initially, we didn't have any background as educators. We certainly didn't see ourselves that way. You can look back and say, oh, yes, you were, Charlie, you were an educator. But we didn't see ourselves that way. We felt we should get some educators to figure out what kind of, and Noel was one of the leading figures in that group that included Stoughton Land, Norma Becker of the United Federation of Teachers, a dozen or so people. I forget all the names that were part of it. I think Stoughton Land was a part of that. But Noel was definitely, and in some ways, the curriculum he designed for Boston modeled the kind of curriculum that began to emerge for implementation in the Freedom School program. Unfortunately, Noel never wrote a book, I don't believe, which is unfortunate.
I just want to say for anyone, and I don't know if Mike or Jamila can find that link, but in Teaching for Change, there is a tremendous amount of information on the Freedom Schools from Mississippi of 1964, how the committee that Charlie is mentioning, that Noel Day and Stoughton were a part of, and how they all met in 63 to begin that process. And all of those curriculum materials are on that site. So Teaching for Change, Freedom Schools, there's a whole lot of information for anyone who's on the call who really wants to dig into doing this in their own community. And as Crystal has said, also link in with her about the many materials that the CDF Freedom Schools have about curriculum development.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone who is sharing links in the chat. We will be sending the copy of our chat from tonight out to all attendees, along with a copy of the recording. So our next question from the audience, can you talk about how you are including people who live in and are from Mississippi in your work with the new Freedom Schools? There are many people who live in Mississippi today whose parents attended the 1960s Freedom Schools and who are grandbabies of the efforts of the work in the 1960s.
Sure. We actually have Dr. Jean Middleton Hairston on the call. And so she is the former national director of CDF Freedom Schools. She's my national director. I came in under her. And so we've actually been able to establish a CDF Freedom Schools program through the Southern Regional Office and Jackson Public Schools. And so we have this summer, we were able to launch that effort. And we are working on some projects where we do some teacher training in Jackson. So stay tuned for that. But we're very much involved. Doc is a member of the school board. They're doing some very important work. And she's very much a part of the CDF Freedom Schools family and movement, and always active in our trainings. And so we try to make sure within the Freedom Schools context that all of our servant leader interns and elevator trainers have a clear understanding of the history. And so we, invite people like Dr. Harris, Doc, Dr. Z to speak on panels, and other, local people to just talk about their experiences in Mississippi so that they can continue the work. We had Mr. Mark Levy on the panel last summer. And so, just get in contact with me. I'm happy to share the resources and keep you posted.
Yeah, just to build, we also do a lot of work with CDF. So like where you see one of us, you see all of us is kind of my manifesto. But what I'd also say is, we do work across the state. We have deep relationships with the Fannie Lou Hamer Institute. So we do work in the Delta, from Kilmichael down. We have programs that folks from Mississippi come to all the time. We also do field work in Mississippi across different organizations. We fiscally sponsor the People's Advocacy Institute that's based in Mississippi. Shout out to Rukia Lumumba, who some of y'all know is Chokwe Lumumba's daughter, Antar's sister. We fiscally sponsor their work. So we do it through actually literally giving our infrastructure to organizations that are trying to hold down grassroots social justice work in the state of Mississippi. And then the second, I told you a little bit earlier, like we administer the royalties of We Shall Overcome back out to organizations that are doing work at the nexus of art and activism. So we've been funding work down in Mississippi, educational interventions in Mississippi for a very long time. Folks have been involved in our youth work, whether it was Children's Justice Camp or the Seeds of Fire crew that are like, Children's Justice Camp is like 3 to maybe 12-year-olds. And then Seeds of Fire is like 12, 13-year-olds to college age young people. And they design their curriculum, they implement their curriculum. They've built community controlled funds to fund other youth organizing interventions and educational interventions. So they run their programs. So it's helped support some of those organizations and more. And now we've started the Southern Power Fund. And so we're giving unrestricted, no strings attached, like $40,000 grants to orgs that are doing work down in Mississippi, in every Southern state, but Mississippi is one of our target areas. So that's just a taste, but like really the folks in Mississippi are not only relevant in all of our educational interventions, which you can see on the website. I'll drop some resources so you can see them. But we also are actively prioritizing them in our fieldwork.
Great, wow.
Thank you.
Jamelia, was there one more question?
There's one more question. And again, if you've dropped your information in the chat box regarding future correspondence, can you please make sure that you share your email address so that we can follow up with you? So the last question for tonight, how do we move beyond the remedial history lessons toward enacting a specific agenda with action steps, dates, and deadlines?
I can make a kind of a response to that. Who is the we here? Okay. I think that question is going to get worked out largely in smaller and local groups who come together and constitute themselves in some way around some part of the work. And that what this larger discussion will do is inform, and if I certainly don't know of anybody that I've been talking to who sees a need for a large central organizing, but we do see a need for collective development of resources, coordination of activities. One of the most remarkable parts of this evening for me is just looking, there are at least six generations of activists here, for 6 decades of activism here, represented just in the people that I can name, right? And the various activist streams, right? The kinds of ideologies and programs that are represented here. It's a remarkably wide range. I think it's very rich. So that one of the most important things that I think we can do is figure out some way to introduce y'all to each other, right? So that folk will know what's going on elsewhere that you can learn from or draw on. Beyond that, 2 steps that I think, 2 conversations that I think will have more specificity, at least about what some people are doing and what they hope to do next. Would be on our tentative next conversations are, just save the dates for now, we'll confirm them later, but there will be November 15th and December 13th. On the 15th, the topic is likely to be some contemporary variations on the Freedom School theme. What people across the country are doing with these ideas and where they see their work going in the future. Right? And I think there would be lots of places there that folk can connect on. And by the way, I see Brother Sharif in the chat. As far as I'm concerned, brother, you're on that panel, but we'll talk later. On the 13th of December, we'd like to bring together the communities that think they see a path to re-engineering traditional schools on Freedom School values. And again, we don't expect everybody to mean exactly the same thing about that. And that's fine. That's what we will learn from, are the differences. But we want to bring some people together to talk about how they see things developing, what they see as the potential hurdles and obstacles. And that will probably be on the 13th of December. So the details on all of that should be going out fairly soon. And so with that, at 9 o'clock,
thank you, Dr. Payne. That question was for me. Thank you.
Oh, that's fine. Thank you for the question. One, thank the panelists, first of all, right? I mean, they gave us a rich introduction to one of the turning points in this discussion and to a model of education that, I hate to use this cliche, but it may be more important now than it was in 1964. The direction of the country is just so frightening at this moment. Education has to be a part of our response. I just thank the panelists for helping us to learn what they have learned and what they continue to learn. I wish I could figure out how many SNCC folk are on this call. I see Jerry Augusto, Judy Richardson, Jennifer Lawson. Boy, that's some senior folk there. I don't know if anyone else is there. I'm sorry I did not see you. At some point, we would like to have that discussion with more of you. And certainly if there are any Freedom School teachers, Ella Baker trainers, who I see as sort of the direct inheritors of the legacy that we're talking about. I just want to thank you for all of your work as well. So beyond that, all I will say is that as I understand where the movement was in 1963, when Charlie wrote that perspective, it was a hard, dark time in the movement. They could not figure out a way to keep white supremacists from shooting people down like dogs in the street. It was a hard time in the movement. And those schools gave a kind of light, right? I mean, they gave folks something to work on that was hopeful. And so there are so many ways in which I think we can learn from and replicate parts of that history. But one of them is that no matter how bad the times are, right? there are ways that we can do better by the young people who have been traditionally abandoned by this country. And I'm very, very hopeful that all the talented people on this call can do a better job if we share our talents with one another. And so for that, I will thank you for being here, and we will absolutely be in touch very, very soon. Oh, I'm sorry. Always got to thank the folk who make the technology possible, because I barely know how to send an email. Michael Simmons, who is behind the scenes trying to work with this. I think at one time we had 140 folk on this. This is just a crazy thing to do for I'm concerned on a Zoom call. And then Jamelia Harris, the two of them between them have made everything work. So special thanks to them as well.
Okay.
All right, y'all. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Have a good evening.
You will.
Thank everyone.
Good night.